rocket keep on shining, shining on the one that's gone and proved untrue. Blue moon up.
So that's mainstream pop. Now let's talk about the origins of country and western, specifically before World War II. So for those of you who have seen the movie from 1980 called The Blues Brothers, starring John Belushi and Dan Aykroyd, there is this joke where they go into this club. There's a band that's going to be playing, and they ask them what kind of genres they play, and the answer is both kinds, country and western. And it's supposed to be a joke as to how unsophisticated these guys are. But the truth is, there really were two genres in country music up to this point. Country was one genre, and western was another. Very distinct. So there's another name for country music that would have been used back when this was actually happening. It wouldn't have been called country initially. It would have been called hillbilly music. But now we think of hillbilly as being almost as like pejorative, derogative term for people from the Appalachia region. So we don't call it hillbilly anymore. We call it country music. So this music was created by and targeted audiences that were white, low income, usually low educated, and living in rural areas. They wrote about themes that these people found relatable. So between country and western, let's start by talking about the country side of this, also called hillbilly music at the time. Again, this is the American Southeast and the South and the Appalachia region. This comes from white gospel music. So we already, with the Mills Brothers, very briefly talked about black gospel. We're going to get into that in a moment when we talk about rhythm and blues. But this is white gospel music from the early 20th century, again, from the South and the Southeast. So a man by the name of Ralph Peer had this research project in the 1920s where what he would do is he would go around recording regional music. Now, today, his recordings are considered a treasure because they are the only records, or at least the earliest records we have, of what this music actually sounded like before the rise of national radio. So at this point, music was still regional, and we are able to hear how this musical style developed before it was influenced by other areas of music. So we have a few important recordings from this time period. The most important one, though, is a song by a man named John Carson, or Fiddlin' John Carson. Now, a fiddle is just a violin, the exact same instrument, it's just the genre. If you pick up this instrument and go play some Bach, it's a violin. Pick up the same instrument, go play some country, it's a fiddle. So Fiddlin' John Carson with his song, The Little Old Log Cabin in the Lane from 1923. Now, John Carson's recording made by Ralph Peer may be one of the earliest examples, but there were certainly others from this time period before World War II. One would be the Carter Family. One of their biggest hits was called, or most important songs, wasn't exactly a hit, but Can the Circle Be Unbroken from 1935. And again, this was a family. In fact, June Carter, who would go on to marry Johnny Cash, was one of the children in this family band. But the mom, Maybelle Carter, is one of the most important figures because she was this amazing guitar player. Her solo, her guitar solo on Can the Circle Be Unbroken, is interesting because she plays the solo with her thumb on the lower strings while playing the chords with her fingers on the upper strings. And normally we think of the guitar solo as being sort of higher pitched, and it's interesting to hear a low solo with the chords on top. Very, very distinct sound by Maybelle Carter. If you were asked to recall one example of the countryside of country and western, I want you to think of Maybelle Carter and the Carter family's rendition of Can the Circle Be Unbroken. I'm not saying that's going to be a question on a test. I'm just saying if you had to think of one example, that would be a great one. Another important figure is Roy Acuff with his song called The Great Speckled Bird from 1936. Now, if you want a little bit of a challenge, pause this video right now and go listen to The Great Speckled Bird, and I want you to tell me or don't tell me, sure, email me, why not? Tell me if you have a guess as to what he's singing about, because it's not actually a bird, it's a metaphor for something. Can you tell from the lyrics and then come back to this video? Okay, let's just assume everyone actually paused and went and did it. Welcome back. Good to see you again. Okay, so hopefully you all emailed me and said it's about the Bible, because you'd be correct. The song The Great Speckled Bird is actually referencing the Bible. Again, this musical genre comes back to white gospel from this region at the time. The song is known for its slide guitar, which was inspired by Hawaiian guitar, and the steel guitar in particular. So 1920s Hawaiian music was really big in America, and this is pulling on that tradition. Again, we're a little removed now from, it's 1936, so radio has sort of come to prominence way more than it had just 13 years earlier with the John Carson stuff. So that's country music. Any of those would be great examples. John Carson, Carter Family, Roy Acuff, but again, you should probably remember the Carter Family. I don't know why, you just probably should. Now let's talk about the Western side. So when we talk about Western music, we're talking about the southwestern quadrant of the United States, specifically states like Texas, Oklahoma, California, Arizona, Nevada, Utah, New Mexico, that region. So we have this idea of something called Western swing. So basically, Western swing is the exact same as a swing band like Glenn Miller or Benny Goodman, any of them, but it has fiddle and it has these Mexican horn sections, actual Mexican musical arrangement, because again, it's right on the border of Mexico. So a Mexican flair being played, Mexican musical stylings and arrangement types being played within these big bands, but adding fiddle, that gives you Western swing. One of the most important groups would be Bob Wills and his Texas Playboys, with their song New San Antonio Rose from 1940, which would later be a pop hit for Bing Crosby. We also have the cowboy image, or the Hollywood cowboy. You know, imagine a cowboy with his hat on, his boots, maybe sitting on a fence at a ranch, watching the sunset, cattle in the background, he's got his horse there. That's the imagery that these songs in cowboy music and Hollywood cowboy movies are trying to evoke. Two of the most important singer-actors from this time period were Gene Autry and Roy Rogers. However, the biggest hit of a country music star before World War II was a man by the name of Jimmie Rodgers. Again, first big country star before the music industry had this big awakening in country music that we'll talk about in a moment. And unfortunately, Jimmie Rodgers died at the age of 36 from tuberculosis. But audiences loved his performances, not just the song. So he was known for his live shows. If you really wanted to experience Jimmie Rodgers, you wanted to see his live performances, not necessarily the case with any of these other groups. Highly influenced by these men like Gene Autry and Roy Rogers. And what's interesting about Jimmie Rodgers is this idea, this is another idea we're going to come back to all throughout the semester, of constructing an image. So he had these two personas that he would use when recording music or performing on stage. One was called the Blue Yodeler, and the other was called the Singing Brakeman. And a brakeman is a railroad worker. So this is something, again, we're going to see this time and time again. David Bowie has multiple personas. One would be Ziggy Stardust. Eminem has multiple personas. Sometimes when it's a little bit more of an honest song, he's just singing as Marshall Mathers. The crazier music, where it's really intense, he has this Slim Shady persona. That's exactly what Jimmie Rodgers was doing back in the in the late 1920s. So he has this image of authenticity, but it doesn't reflect his real life experiences. So when he's singing as the Singing Brakeman, he's really singing like he's a railroad worker, but he's not a railroad worker, things like that. If you want to hear an example of his Blue Yodeler persona, listen to Blue Yodel from 1927, and yodeling is a Swiss variety of singing. Today, we think of Nashville, Tennessee as being the center for country music in America. How did it get to be that way? Because it certainly wasn't the case before World War II. So after 1945, let's talk about how Nashville becomes the home of country music. We also have to talk about how country music and Western music, which were these two genres that were played for, again, these rural white audiences, how they were able to become popular enough to even have a big city as its center, and how they merged into basically one style. Like we think today, we think of country and Western, which has been shortened just to country, and it includes both genres together. So really it all comes down to radio exposure. It's radio that leads to Nashville becoming this center for music. The only styles on radio initially were mainstream pop, like I mentioned, but also classical music. Classical music was very important before World War II to listen to on the radio. Almost no country and Western unless you live in one of those regions, and almost no rhythm and blues. with these superstations, idea we talked about earlier, we start to see some rules develop in early radio licensing, something that would become the FCC. So questions like how large a region can be covered, what frequencies can you broadcast over? Frequencies are like on the dial of the radio where it has like the number like 91.1 or 91.3. The difference between those are two different frequencies, two speeds that the radio waves are moving are going to play different songs from different radio stations. So how do you divide that up? And what power can you use to boost your signal? Well, again, we talked about this earlier, but there's a certain level for the sun where it has to be quieter from the superstations at least, and then at night they can crank up the power, getting a range of, as I mentioned, up to 600 miles in any direction. Well, a superstation is developed in Nashville called WSM Nashville, and the radio program on that station is called the Grand Ole Opry. This program leads to the establishment of Nashville as a center for country music, the Grand Ole Opry from WSM Nashville. There are some other important superstations for country music, though. WLS Chicago has a program called National Barn Dance, which is also very popular. It was a 30-minute radio program that would air. And what happens is Barn Dance gets in on NBC syndication sort of as a novelty, just thinking, hey, some country and western fans might be listening in. So 1933, they start syndicating this. This means that NBC is sending this program to their affiliate station. So it's getting more play than just people within the 600-mile radius of Chicago. Well, country becomes more and more popular, largely because of NBC. In 1939, what happens is the show you need to be on and the show you need to come to see, because again, it got famous through this National Barn Dance program in Chicago, but the Grand Ole Opry still emerges as the one that you want to be on, which is really kind of an interesting turn of events. But if you want to be a hit in country music, again, you have to be on the radio. And the most important station becomes Grand Ole Opry, which is in Nashville. So because people are coming to Nashville anyway, these recording studios start popping up in Nashville, and then publishing houses start popping up, and then guitar stores, and then booking agents. And so many people are coming there, they have restaurants and hotels and hardware stores. And because they have all these other amenities, now people are thinking, well, I can actually live here. So then they build houses, and then the industry grows. So it keeps growing, growing, growing because of this syndication from these programs, National Barn Dance and the Grand Ole Opry. Well, through this program, specifically the Grand Ole Opry, there's this idea of a constructed image, just like Jimmie Rodgers. Again, this is going to be another one of those big ideas, this constructed images of what they thought, people thought of country musicians and country music. So really they were caricatures of country music. They weren't singing and acting the way they really would. They were sort of putting on this show, right? So we have this early singer called Minnie Pearl, and she would have her price tag on her hat. And she would go out there, and again, it was a radio program, but there's also a live audience. So the idea was that she was so unsophisticated that she would leave the price tag on, either because she didn't know to take it off or she wanted people to see how much money she spent. But again, this is a gag. This is something that's supposed to be funny. We also have this character of Grandpa Jones, who acts and sings like this old man, but really he's 35 years old, and he's just wearing a white wig and a beard. Well, this, through the 1930s, country music is gaining steam, and you get to the point where Nashville is starting to develop. It's not quite there yet. But it's gaining steam. So what happens is really it's World War II that leads to Nashville's widespread success. So what happens is people in these basic training camps for the military are meeting. A lot of these cities are in the South, but it's people from all over the country. So they're meeting men from other parts, from other states, and they're sharing music with each other. And a lot of people who are not from the American South or the Southeast are hearing country and Western music sometimes for the first time, and they're really enjoying it. Well, finally, in the war, Roy Acuff, singer of The Great Speckled Bird, is voted the most popular singer in the armed services. And Japanese kamikaze pilots actually find out about this, and they would say things and scream things and like paint these messages, things like, to hell with Roosevelt, to hell with Babe Ruth, to hell with Roy Acuff. So Roy Acuff came to represent American culture to our Japanese enemies at the time. So the Northerners finally go home back to their urban areas, but they bring country music with them. They're trying to hear country music. Maybe they live within 600 miles of Chicago or Nashville. They can pick up the signal. Maybe they're getting it from these syndicated radio stations, or they're calling their local big radio stations asking for syndication from one of these other cities. So country music after World War II really gains speed. Well, Roy Acuff and his business partner, Fred Rose, opened a publishing business in Nashville called Acuff Rose. And Fred Rose was from New York, and he was this kind of experienced music industry professional from New York City. So he's bringing this New York business savvy sense with Roy Acuff, who is a famous country and western singer, into their publishing house, Acuff Rose in Nashville. Their first big hit was from a woman we talked about earlier by the name of Patti Page with her hit, The Tennessee Waltz. And the royalties, the money they make from that song, allows them to grow their business. Well, with the money they raised, in 1946, they sign a man by the name of Hank Williams. At first, they signed him as a songwriter, but eventually they realized that he's actually a very talented performer as well, so they quickly switched to make him a singer and performer. Hank Williams is in Nashville, once the country music has moved to Nashville as its home, is easily the most important figure. So the most important figure before Nashville, before World War II, Jimmie Rodgers. The most important figure after, Hank Williams. So let's talk about some of his biggest hits. We have Move It On Over from 1947. And Hank Williams actually was one who was first introduced to the world on a program called Louisiana Hayride, which was broadcast from Shreveport, Louisiana, where years later on that exact same program, Elvis would introduce his music to the world. Well, after that, Hank Williams is in Nashville and he's releasing these songs, Your Cheating Heart, Cold Cold Heart, Hey Good Lookin', and I Saw the Light, releasing this music on programs like the Grand Ole Opry, publishing it in Nashville, showing how success. He's this huge figure in country music. And again, by this point, a lot of people are listening to country, not just people originally from the South. And because of Hank Williams' success, he is considered the first big star of Nashville. Another genre we see come out of Nashville during this time is a subgenre called bluegrass. Now, with most genres, we can't say where it got its start. We can say that it was many events, right? We can say, oh, it's this and this and this, and it was this time frame. That's kind of what we're talking about with this whole lecture, right? The birth of rock and roll. It's so complex. There are all these genres. We haven't even had a chance to really get into rhythm and blues just yet, but there's so much going on in music at this time. It's difficult to say where any genre starts. However, bluegrass is one of the rarest exceptions where we can very definitively say exactly when, where, and who were responsible for the start of bluegrass. So it may sound like it goes back really far in history, certainly before 1945, but that's not the case. It was actually by a man named Bill Monroe and his band, the Bluegrass Boys. Bill Monroe and his Bluegrass Boys. So their first big hit is a song called Blue Moon of Kentucky from 1946. This is actually one of my favorite bluegrass songs. It's the first big one, but there are a lot of great bluegrass songs, but it's one of my favorites because of this really cool shift. It starts off as this slow ballad waltz and shifts into a really fast song in 4/4, or common time. Not only would Blue Moon of Kentucky, as it was performed by Bill Monroe and his Bluegrass Boys, become a hit on its own, but it was also Elvis Presley's first record. He released a double-sided record with That's All Right Mama and Blue Moon of Kentucky. So in bluegrass, we have fiddle, mandolin, banjo, guitar, what is called a bass fiddle, just an upright bass, and no drums allowed. They're just too loud and overpowering. Also, the other instruments you can walk around and transport more easily. Drum set, not only is it fixed in one position, but it's difficult to transport a drum set. Eventually, they would allow drums on things like on programs such as Grand Ole Opry, but not initially. There was always one mic for bluegrass, so we don't have the same strict structure in music like we see in other genres, because we have to allow for something called walking time. So let's say someone's gonna, like the violin, or excuse me, the fiddle player is gonna walk up and do a solo. Everyone else is just gonna keep the music vamping while the fiddle player walks up to the mic to do his solo, and then he walks back and the banjo player walks forward so you can hear the banjo more prominently because it has to get closer to the mic. So there is a genre of jazz called bebop, which is considered the most complex and virtuosic. Virtuosity just means like a master musician. virtuosic style of jazz to play, one of the most difficult genres in general, bluegrass is considered the bebop of country and western, or the virtuosic style of country and western. It's very difficult to play, very fast, challenging pieces. There were a few members from Bill Monroe's group that are important. Earl Scruggs, whose banjo style is still the emblem of bluegrass. If you hear an Earl Scruggs style banjo playing, people just hear that and associate it with bluegrass in general. And also a man by the name of Lester Flatt. So both Earl Scruggs and Lester Flatt had success in the early years of bluegrass, but really a lot of their success is actually in their work together as a duo.